Chimps are brutal creatures, man. Like, they go to war, eh? And so if you have a chimp territory out in the jungle, then the juveniles will, the males in particular, they'll band together in groups of 4 or 5. There's often, but not always, a female or 2 with them. And if they come across chimps from another troop that aren't within their hierarchy, let's say, they will, if they outnumber them, because they can't really count, but they can estimate magnitude visually. It's not the same as counting. But if they outnumber them, they will tear them to pieces. And chimps are at least twice as strong as a really well-developed human male. And so they can tear you up pretty good. And chimps are perfectly capable. They hunt. They're carnivorous, like human beings. And they hunt colobus monkeys often. They weigh about 40 pounds. And they'll basically eat them alive. Right? The monkey's screaming away like mad because, you know, it's in pain because it's being eaten. And that doesn't slow the chimps down a bit. There's no cross-species empathy stopping them from having their snack. And so chimps are very brutal creatures. And it isn't obvious they have a lot of internal inhibition of their aggression at all. Most of the inhibition is sociological. It's out in the hierarchy. And so the reason chimps aren't always aggressive with one another is because they know who can pound them and who will gang up on them and who won't. They establish their hierarchy. Anyways, you know, you think about a chimp hierarchy and you're talking about a fairly strong and aggressive creature. You might think it's biggest, ugliest, meanest, most vicious, irritable, unpleasant chimp that rises to the top. Well, that's kind of the postmodernist view of human society. But that's not the case. It happens sometimes. But what happens, and de Waal has documented this quite nicely, is that tyrant chimps lead unstable regimes. Now, you know, that might sound familiar because the same thing, of course, is true of human beings. And why is that? Well, it's because, you know, people don't like tyrants, and chimps don't like them that much either. And chimps are actually quite reciprocal in their social interactions. So they don't just dominate each other, they groom each other, they have friendships, they contract social relationships over very long periods of time. You know, and they do that. And so they engage in reciprocal interactions, let's say pro-social reciprocal interactions. And you might think, well, what's the weak point of the biggest, ugliest, toughest chimp in the troop? And that is he doesn't have any friends. And so, you know, maybe he has a bad day. He's a little hungover or whatever from eating fermented bananas or whatever he is partying with. And 2 of the slightly less ugly, slightly less mean chimps decide, well, this is a good time to take him out, and they tear him to pieces. And so one of the things de Waal has pointed out quite nicely is that if you want to have a stable chimp dominance hierarchy, let's call it a regime, the stable ones aren't ruled by the tyrants because the tyrants get taken out by paired up friendship dyads, something like that. So that's really worth thinking about too, you know, because it indicates that even in creatures that have less complex sociological orders, and they do, because one of the things that predicts how complex your social order is how big your brain is compared to your body. It's encephalization, essentially. And the more encephalized a creature, the larger the social groups it can track. And of course, human beings are very highly encephalized, so we have quite complicated group organizations. But even in simpler group organizations like the chimps, it isn't the tyrant who rules stably. And that turns out to be also incredibly important. Okay, so, you know, so much for the idea that power is the only game in town. Then you got to ask the question is, well, this is actually a postmodern question. So, you know, one of the things Derrida said, the main postmodern joker, is that by categorizing, you privilege one concept and you force other concepts out to the margins. And so he believed that when you constructed a hierarchy of power, the hierarchy of power privileged certain people and marginalized others. And you know, that's really not that brilliant an observation as far as I'm concerned. It's rather commonplace. All it means is that when you categorize something, that there are things that are in the category and a bunch of things that aren't. And so you actually can't categorize anything, which means you can't perceive anything, which means you can't think or live without making some things in the middle and everything else on the outside. It's part of categorization itself. And so maybe the postmodernists would go far enough to question the utility of categorization itself, and I think to some degree they do that. But the point here is that if you have to ask why it is that you would, if you were a postmodernist yourself, why it is that you would privilege the idea of power above all else. It's exactly what is it that you're pushing to the margin. And so that's something that we're going to talk about. Now, here's one thing you might push to the margin. Let's say that you believe that hierarchies are a consequence of power. Well, then you push competence to the margin. And then applying the postmodernist logic, you might say, well, the reason you're privileging power is so that you can push competence to the margin. And so you want to keep that in mind too, because that's going to become important as we discuss the relationship between postmodernism and Marxism. Maybe you're after the destruction of the idea of competence itself. All right, so, okay. Postmodernism, we talked about it a little bit, we'll return to it. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Marxism. I've got a quote here from Marx. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. Well, that was pretty good for like 1880 or 1890 or whenever it was he wrote it, somewhere around that period of time. Turned out the proletarians had a lot more to lose than their chains. They had their lives and their families to lose. And that was demonstrated amply as a consequence of the, what would you call it, the sociological movements that were put into place when the Marxist presuppositions began to govern societies like the Soviet Union. So, all right, so let's take the same postmodernist approach. So here's some basic tenets of Marxism. It's bourgeoisie against proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the capitalists, the property owners, those sorts of people. The proletariat, working class, for all intents and purposes. The basic idea is that history itself is nothing but the, what would you call it, the documentation of the struggle of one class against the other. No, like that's wrong, but it's okay because it's too simple, obviously. It's obviously too simple. There's all sorts of motivations that people have. Some of them are economic, some of them are associated with power. But that's okay. We'll leave that. Let's give the devil his due and say, well, yeah, fair enough. There is still a fair bit of tension between the haves and the have-nots, and maybe that was even more intense in previous societies than it is now. And there's no doubt that economics plays a role in virtually everything that human beings do, and a fairly significant role. So let's accept that as a potential theory. It's simple, but maybe it's practically useful. And then there's kind of an offshoot of that theory, which is that, well, if you're a Marxist, that means you have sympathy for the working class, right? Because that's what you're saying all the time. It's like, well, the poor working class, they're all oppressed, the poor proletariat, you know, and then you're also saying, well, we're the good guys because we're standing on the side of the oppressed. And so then you might also ask what you're marginalizing when you claim that you're the good guys, because one of the things that you would be marginalizing is all of the ways in which you're not the good guys, but we can leave that aside for a moment too. So, but there's the claims, is that, you know, there's the working class against the ruling class. Another claim is the ruling class because they exploit the working class, basically stealing their excess labor from them. Another very, very, surfacely attractive claim that lacks any reasonable justification, you know, because it's predicated on the idea of the world as a zero-sum game, and clearly the world is not a zero-sum game. So when someone creates wealth, when someone is wealthy, it can be, at least at times, because they created it, not because they swiped it from someone else. I think, you know, you can think of someone like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs as a good example of that. You know, what they produced had a value that far exceeded what they garnered as a consequence of their production, even though what they garnered was very substantial. So anyways, but we'll get, like I said, we're going to give the devil his due. Okay, it's the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. We'll accept that. It's class warfare as the primary historical mover. No problem. Now, but here's one I'm not willing to give away so easily. We have sympathy for the working class, primarily, and we're good because of that. No, I'm not going to just like give that away so simply. So let's investigate that a little bit. Let's see if we can actually figure out if that's true. We'll say, we use a pragmatic approach, because I'm a pragmatist. in the William James sense. Or maybe you could think about it even more deeply and anciently. There's a statement in the New Testament, I think it's, by their fruits you shall know them. Fine. So we're going to walk down that road. Before we do that, so now that's another thing you have to keep in mind. Before we do that, I want to make one more detour, okay? So I like making detours and then tangling them all back together.